Good evening and welcome back. You're watching World Talks here on TVP World. The re-election of Donald Trump to the White House is perhaps the top issue on European politicians' minds at the moment. Dozens of them attended a meeting in Budapest, European Political Community Summit, to talk it through. What could the change in the White House mean for Europe and NATO? To discuss, I have Joshua Huminski, Director, Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs, joining me right now. Good evening, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So let me just cut right to the chase. Will Donald Trump cut funding for Ukraine, and shall we be concerned?
I think the European community can expect that there is definitely going to be a change in the United States' policy towards Ukraine. What that looks like in practice remains to be seen, but they should certainly expect a change. It could be a reduction in funding, it could be a withdrawal of aid, but that change will certainly come, and there's going to be a concomitant expectation that European partners are going to have to step in and stand up. What you've seen, unfortunately, is both on the Republican side and the Democrat side, an unwillingness to articulate what a viable strategy for Ukraine is. And unfortunately, regardless of who was going to be elected in the White House, there was going to be a change one way or the other.
Right. So, there is much talk about who could potentially form Trump's cabinet, right? Various names are being floated. So what is your take on that? Any guesses?
It's all speculation at this point. What you've seen prior to the election was quiet vetting of various potential candidates. Understandably, those individuals were not necessarily wanted to be seen as being frontrunners. It's never be good to be seen a frontrunner, or potentially being seen as a viable candidate for the cabinet. Excuse me. So there's a lot of names being thrown around, but that is a very important factor to consider: is who is the president going to surround himself with, and where their position is going to be. Because the president obviously is going to set the tone. It's going to be the cabinet that executes those policies.
Right, because there are names like the name of Mike Pompeo, who is very pro-Ukraine. However, some others are not, right? So when will we know more?
It's difficult to say. You're probably going to see a lot of speculation in the run-up for the next couple of weeks, and certainly in advance of the president's inauguration in January. I would be very wary of listening to a lot of the speculation. You can get a general sense of what you're going to see, potential candidates, but those frontrunners are not necessarily the frontrunners who ultimately come through in the end. So we will see in the coming days, and I doubt the president is going to want to tip his hand too early. So it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks, to say the least.
Definitely. But when Trump was not in office over the last 4 years, he still maintained pretty close ties with some politicians, such as Viktor Orban. I think he is a good example here. So do you see a realignment of power in Europe happening as a result of this presidential election in the States?
I think a realignment of power is a bit strong of a phrase for it. I think what you're going to see is the countries in Europe that are best able to navigate the Trump presidency are the ones who are going to be able to recognize the American change in posture. President Trump is a lot more predictable, I think, than people think. One is the America First idea, and what that means in practice is not America alone, but it's the prioritization very clearly of American interests and what is beneficial for the United States. So the countries that know how to navigate that process and say, for example, on continental security, we are spending above the 2% GDP requirements for NATO spending, for example. That is a benefit to the United States, and here is why. The countries that know how to navigate the trade interests, particularly as it relates to China, being strong on China is going to be a very important thing to the Trump presidency. So the countries and leaders who know how to navigate that process, who know how to separate what Trump says versus what the administration does. He's a president who is going to fire from the hip quite frequently. And separating that from the actual substance of policy is going to be critical. And those countries who know how to navigate that are going to be the ones who are most successful in dealing with Washington.
Right, so you've mentioned a strong stance on China. And of course, we're talking about tariffs here, even 60% from what Trump said, but also tariffs for goods coming from Europe, right? 20% perhaps. Do you think that this is going to happen?
That policy right there is going to be very critical to see how we look at the security posture and the economic posture, and if those two conflict. President Trump, for example, in the first administration, unfortunately found himself in effectively a trade war with China as well as Europe at the same time. That was a consequence of the trade policy, and who he brings in to execute that is going to have to be a lot more savvy in navigating those dynamics. You certainly don't want to find yourself in a trade conflict with both at the same time when you need Europe in order to realign against China. So how those trade policies and these economic policies set up is going to be critical for transatlantic relations.
Right, and some analysts are also mentioning that these tariffs on Chinese goods and actually the worsening of relationship with China, even though it's not the best right now, could translate into the situation in Taiwan, sort of, becoming more difficult. Do you see it that way?
I think what you're going to see again is just in the situation with European security, a greater expectation by the president for Taiwan to be responsible for its own security, but also a realignment of American power and American interest towards that region. So, where the European community and European nations stand on China vis-a-vis Taiwan is going to be critical for that policy. If there is a greater recognition, and you've already seen a lot of countries in Europe come out with their own policies towards China, towards the Indo-Pacific, in recognition of what was a long-term rebalancing of American interests towards that region, that is going to help those countries in Europe be better aligned with the United States as it relates to China and towards Taiwan.
Right, and we've been discussing all these shifts, right? I mean, it seems like tectonic changes, really. But I wonder, they will probably take some time. I mean, what is the time frame on all this?
It's always going to be subject to events. As you've seen, certainly when President Obama announced the rebalancing in 2011, the next 10 years were all about trying to get American power and interest away from the Middle East towards the Indo-Pacific. In practice, that didn't actually happen. So you're absolutely right. There is the difference between what the stated interests are and the stated policies will be and their implementation. So there's always going to be a bit of a lag period. You're going to be having an administration coming in that's going to be more savvy than the first administration was in 2016. You're going to be bringing people with it who know how to use the levers of power and governance to get things done. So I think you can expect a bit faster of a pace rather than a completely new administration, which President Trump's was in 2016, who came in trying to figure out how to get things done. A presidency for for Donald Trump in 2025, when he steps in office, is going to know how to get things done. So it's probably going to be a bit quicker than it was in 2016. But let's also not forget that he's also going to have to deal with Congress. Congress has a significant say in these policies, and there's no reason to assume that just because he has control, or the Republicans have control of the House and the Senate, that he's going to be able to get things done as easily as he may expect. So it'll be faster, but it's going to be dictated by events and how he deals with Congress.
Oh, it is very interesting. And I mean, much has been said about the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump did not have the best relationship, right? However, to the contrary, Trump has a very good relationship with Netanyahu. So I wonder, what kind of developments are we expecting in the Middle East?
That's going to be a very interesting one to see how that plays out in particular. You're absolutely right. President Trump has stronger relations with Netanyahu than he does certainly Zelensky, and he's very pro-Israel and pro-Netanyahu. I think what you're going to see is more of a consistent support for Israel than perhaps President Biden was. But one thing to remember here is I think that President Biden found out, and certainly Trump may find out as well, is that the United States' influence over Israel's actions, particularly for its own security and defense, is considerably limited versus what it may have been, say, under President George W. Bush, circa 2000, 2001, thereabouts. That relationship dynamic has changed quite a lot, I think. The person to person, leader to leader relationships will be strong, but the way that Israel is pursuing its own security and defense policy is almost going to be, almost certainly going to be more enabled by President Trump than it would have been by President Harris.
Right. However, at the same time, I'm assuming that it will be in America's interest for the conflict in the Middle East to sort of die down, right? I mean, as opposed to sort of exacerbating it.
Absolutely. It is certainly in the United States' interest that the conflict does not escalate, particularly as it relates to Iran. But you're going to see a situation where the United States has limited power over Israel or influence in Israel. Those person to person relationships, as I mentioned, are going to be stronger. But the reality is, it's going to be almost in Israel's interest with President Trump because he's going to be able to get more things done and more with more support from Washington towards Jerusalem, excuse me.
Right, and leaving the Middle East aside, I wanted to go back to Europe and specifically to countries like Poland. So my question is, would the choice of Donald Trump as the next president actually deepen rifts within countries like Poland?
I certainly couldn't speak to the situation, how it's going to develop within Poland. I can say that what you will see is the potential for friction points along those partisan lines. I mean, as you mentioned, there is a divergence within Polish in terms of Polish politics for alignment for American politics. And that could create frictions depending on what happens within the respective countries and their respective elections. If you do have a party coming into office that is more typically aligned with a traditional, say, inverted commas, Democrat position or liberal versus a Republican and conservative position, those frictions could certainly exacerbate, as can the ecosystem around that. As you have foreign politicians coming out and saying things, the president may seize upon those. He's certainly more vocal about identifying troublemakers, if you will, or certainly vocal opponents and reacting against those. So there is the potential for friction when you do not necessarily have partisan alignment. And again, it's going to be the countries that know how to navigate what is a more predictable Trump presidency than not that are going to be the most successful.
Right, and what about the EU? Because we have politicians like Orban and Fico, right, from Slovakia, and then of course Giorgia Meloni from Italy. Do you think that there will be also a change in EU's policies?
I think the key question with the EU policies is really going to come down to the economic side of the equation more than necessarily personality politics. President Trump may get better along with, say, Giorgia Meloni than perhaps somebody like Olaf Scholz for the sake of argument. But it's really going to come down to the substance of policies and the dictation of events that is going to shape those dynamics. The EU is going to have to find a way of balancing a America that is prioritizing America first in inverted commas trade policy versus sort of the free market open trade relations of what you could almost argue as being an incomplete globalization process. So the European Union is going to find itself in a situation where it has to balance competition with the United States as well as cooperation on the trade realms and economics with Washington.
Right, lots of important changes awaiting us, but I mean, let's see how it all goes. Joshua Huminski, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to joining again soon.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World. News Bulletin coming up at the top of the hour.